think what they're trying to do is keep the system from collapsing. We're on this system that's historically been called inflate or die. You continue to inflate. If you don't inflate, the system collapses on its own weight because of the level of debt that's existing in the system today. What we're likely to see, and we've already seen it to some extent, is inflation and regimentation. In other words, there'll be more financial controls to try to keep the system from collapsing, because regimentation means it erodes liberty. We're already seeing that by the financial repression that central banks are doing by forcing interest rates to artificially low levels, or limiting the amount of cash you can carry in your pocket when you leave the country, and a lot of other things that they're doing. But the question is, can they do it, and will the system eventually collapse? Well, no fiat currency system based on government promises throughout history, none of those have ever survived. They've all eventually collapsed. And it will do, and unless we get back on the right road.
Welcome back to another RTD interview. Today, I'm excited to have a returning guest, Mr. James Turk. He's the author, educator, as well as founder of goldmoney.com. And today, James joins us to share his thoughts on the economy, precious metal sector, as well as his most recent book, Money and Liberty, in the Pursuit of Happiness and the Theory of Natural Money. So, James, welcome back to RTD.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be with you.
Yes, I appreciate you for taking time to sit down to talk about current events, prior events, and just try to put the pieces of the puzzle together to better understand where we're at and where we're heading from a financial monetary standpoint. And so for those that, and of course, you're not new to me, you've been key and instrumental in my monetary journey. And so we've had a chance to connect throughout the years on your other work. And so I want to just start off right away, at this current moment, 2022, the beginning of 2022, what are some things that concern you as well as possibly excite you moving forward throughout the rest of this year?
I think number one on the list right now in terms of concerning me is inflation. I was a young man in the early 1970s, so I lived through the 1970s and know very well what that did to society, how it disrupted people's financial plans, and how we ended up finally getting rid of inflation. And the steps that Paul Volcker took back in 1979, he was the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time. We know that he has to raise it. He raised interest rates, and we know that's the only way to fight inflation. So far, the Federal Reserve is not fighting inflation. They're talking about raising interest rates, but they're not actually doing it. Paul Volcker, on the other hand, came into the Federal Reserve. He did what was called the October surprise, raise interest rates essentially overnight, and convinced the market that by raising interest rates and continuing to do that until the market believed that he was going to save the dollar and end inflation, he continued raising interest rates, and that was eventually it brought inflation under control. We're not seeing that this time around. So that suggests to me the big concern for 2022 is going to be more inflation in the year ahead.
Right. Now, one of the things that will probably compound that issue of inflation is that the Federal Reserve appears to be doing something unprecedented. And so as far as they're trying to dial back on their accommodative policy, i.e. bond purchases, mortgage-backed securities, all those things that they've been supportive of, as well as, raise interest rates. Some say, by March, 3 to 4 different times, we'll see. And then also trying to institute quantitative tightening, withdrawing some of the prior bond purchases and whatnot on their balance sheet. That's never happened before. In your opinion, is that their attempt to try to address inflation, or are they probably trying to do something else, in your opinion?
Well, I think what they're trying to do is keep the system from collapsing. We're on this system that has historically been called inflate or die. You continue to inflate. If you don't inflate, the system collapses on its own weight because of the level of debt that's existing in the system today, not just in the United States, but worldwide. What we're likely to see, and we've already seen it to some extent, is inflation and regimentation. In other words, there'll be more financial controls to try to keep the system from collapsing. And that's, I think, as worrying as much as it is as the outlook for more inflation, because regimentation means it erodes liberty. We're already seeing that by the financial repression that central banks are doing by forcing interest rates to artificially low levels, or limiting the amount of cash you can carry in your pocket when you leave the country, and a lot of other things that they're doing. But I think we can see more regimentation to try to keep the system from collapsing. But the question is, can they do it, and will the system eventually collapse? Well, no fiat currency system, in other words, based on government promises, a currency system based on government promises throughout history. None of those have ever survived. They've all eventually collapsed. And I think this one has to collapse too, unless we get back on the right road. And I think that's the key element that we need to focus on. How do we get back on the right road? I think precious metals are the answer. They worked for thousands of years. They still work. An ounce of gold buys the same amount of crude oil it did 50 years ago. I like to use the example, Mike, and I do this in the book, that when I was growing up in the 1950s, I'd watch my parents drive the family car into the local gas station and fill it up with $2 silver. Today, the value of the silver in the $2 silver will still fill up the family car, but $2 doesn't even buy a gallon of gas. So we have to go back to what worked up until 1971. In other words, tie the money to gold and silver.
Right,
and until we do that, we're going to see more inflation.
Right. I do agree. And so one of the things that really baffles me is that how complicated this current monetary system has become with all of the financial products spun off of, the advent of fiat currency. And it's how the Federal Reserve note, because I like to distinguish between Federal Reserve note, which is a debt instrument, and then a dollar, which is, of course, gold, silver, from the coinage acts and whatnot throughout history.
Right.
Every country and every person around this planet here acknowledges the Federal Reserve note as so I was, using an example in Africa, how in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, those people there, they would love to get a hold of Federal Reserve notes right now because it's more reliable than their own currency. And then, of course, we have the euro dollar system and all that complicated stuff there. And so as much as I, talk against the Federal Reserve note, it still seems that it has a place at this current time, unless something else is presented that will take its place. And so that's kind of where I'm trying to navigate. How might that play out? Because the world still needs dollars, yet they are being debased rapidly, especially over the last 2 years because of this current experience we're having. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, one hedge fund manager described national currencies as trying to choose the best horse in a glue factory.
Yeah.
You can't win. The only way you can win is if you go back to what's been sound money for thousands of years, which is, of course, gold and silver. Obviously, the dollars are better than currencies of a lot of other countries, which are debasing the currency even more rapidly than the US dollar is being debased, or than the Federal Reserve note is being debased. And I think that's a key point too, because what we talk about today is the US dollar being, the Federal Reserve dollar being a US dollar, but the Federal Reserve is not a US dollar. The US dollar is a weight of gold officially, but we use this Federal Reserve note as a money substitute in place of the dollar. We have to get rid of the Federal Reserve. We have to go back to the way the system used to work. The 20th century has basically been a disaster in terms of monetary events. Because remember, when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, an ounce of gold could be exchanged for $20.67 an ounce. So it's been a one-way street in terms of debasement of the dollar versus gold. And we have to go back to gold, once again, pre-20th century type of thinking, pre-20th century type of experience, get rid of the Federal Reserve.
Right. And so one of the things that, that of course, that is clearly the answer. But yet we're in a world where nothing really makes sense anymore, in my personal opinion. And with the invention or the release of the digital asset space, i.e. Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, all the things that's evolved the last 10, 11, 12 years, there's more people excited about actually getting involved in that digital realm and the metaverse and all the things being created from that than there is interest in going backwards towards actually owning something tangible, real that you can feel, i.e. gold and silver and all the other, even the base metals itself. More people are enticed with the idea of profiting off of this transition than they are in going back. And that's one of the things that, it kind of makes things hard to continue to try to share this information because most people are being lured by, as they say, how can they pump their bags, i.e. referring to the digital currency stuff. So do you think it's really even possible at this current moment, given that, just how money is evolving, it's automatically going digital, it seems. It's an uphill battle, it seems, continuously.
Yeah. Well, let me, a couple of points, just because you're raising a very, very good point. We have to distinguish between money on the one hand and currency on the other. They're different things, but the difference was lost in the 20th century. Money is gold and silver coin. Currency is anything that circulates in place of money. Remember, they call them cryptocurrencies. They don't call them crypto money. And the reason why they don't do that is because cryptos are not money. It's just a form of circulating accounts, units of account, but it doesn't have all of the characteristics that money does. But the advantages and disadvantages of cryptocurrency and gold and silver are actually mutually complementary. So the way I see it is that the gold guys and the silver guys and the crypto guys, they're all on the same side of the fence versus the fiat currency guys. Mm-hmm. And the way I see cryptocurrencies is it's a stepping stone to something better out there. Yeah, I'm in my mid 70s, and I remember from the 1950s using silver coins. The younger generation didn't have the same opportunity that I had. Also, the younger generation is more comfortable with computers than I was, which didn't exist when I was growing up. So the younger generation is learning about currency through cryptos, and eventually I think they're going to find something better than cryptos, which of course is gold and silver, circulating digitally in the internet, which is one of the things that we pioneered in gold money. But we're still away from that. It's a process that people have to learn and educate themselves. Fiat is the worst situation. They're learning that cryptos are better than fiat, but the next best thing is actually gold and silver.
Right. I do agree. And so I just witnessed how things are evolving so fast. And especially as this current monetary structure is starting to have hiccups, there seems to be a global coordination of all central banks to prepare their central bank digital currencies, as a lot of nations that have already moved away from cash itself, which has been the best form of, I guess, in a short time since gold and silver was removed, the best form of having something you can actually have in your possession outside of the system. Right. And so now we're going towards central bank digital currencies, or solely digital, outside of the commercial bank digital ledger, versions of currencies we've had. And so to me, it's not by coincidence. It's a part of a greater plan. And so you mentioned getting rid of the Federal Reserve. That'd be great. But then again, it's all central banks, the BIS, World Bank. I mean, all those entities are in on this. So, the question will be, how do we get back to gold and silver at the same time they're trying to, rebrand currency to a solely digital form?
Yeah, you're bringing up a good point about, central bank digital currencies and all that. It ties into what I'm talking about, regimentation. They're doing things to try to keep the system from collapsing. But as they do these things, they impair our liberty. They take away our freedom to act. They take away our freedom to use our financial resources in the way we want to use our financial resources. And that's very harmful. In terms of how it's going to play out, we can't predict the future. Nobody knows how things are going to unfold. But it seems to me that there's only the good way or the bad way. And so if we look back in history, we can see the good way and we can see also bad ways. In Germany in the 1920s, when the currency ultimately collapsed, they went the bad way, and it ultimately led to World War II. In 1780, in the young American country, in the young United States, the currency collapsed. It was called the Continental. This was the currency that they used during the War for Independence. And one of the reasons why the framers created the Constitution was to create a sound monetary unit. They did three things. They wanted a common market, a common defense, and a common currency. Mm-hmm. And the dollar was defined as a weight of silver at that time. It eventually became a weight of gold. And they went the right way. They went back to rule of law and using gold and silver as a form of money, and also circulating as currency. And it was in the Mint Act of 1792, one of the first acts of Congress. What they did is they said that the federal government can coin money, but the federal government doesn't have the power to print money, and it doesn't have the power to give the Federal Reserve the exclusive powers to print money. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So yeah, we have to get rid of the Fed. We have to get rid of central banks. People say that gold is the barbarous relic, quoting Keynes, but the reality is that central banks are the barbarous relic. And if you enjoy, or if you're a lover of liberty, as I am, I think central banks are standing in the way of enabling people to live and act freely.
Right. And so in your opinion, this decade here, 2020, we've witnessed some things that we could never imagine, especially dealing with our freedom over the last year or two or so. Different parts of the country, those types of tyrannical responses are still taking place. But, in your lifetime, could you have ever foreseen the current events we've witnessed over the last 2 years occurring now? At the same time, they're trying to rebrand and redo things from the monetary standpoint as well.
I never thought it would come to this, to be honest, Mike. I'm a student of history. I've got about 3,000 books in my library, and I've read an awful lot. I never thought it would happen to the United States that we would get in this kind of situation, but it has. And we have to learn from it, and we have to come out of it the right way. We know what the answers are. What we need is political leadership and the political will to make things happen, to change the system, which is inherently unfair. And let me give you an example of what I mean by unfair. If you work for a year and you earn $50,000, if you're a farmer or if you're a builder or whatever it happens to be, it takes a lot of work and effort to create something of value in order to earn that purchasing power, the $50,000 that you then have to be able to fulfill your needs and your wants and take care of yourself and your family. But the government, on the other hand, it goes to the central bank and says, I want to spend $1 million, give me $1 million in my bank account, which the Federal Reserve creates out of thin air, and what I call phantom purchasing power. And there's no work or anything that goes into it. But that $1 million is now competing with the $50,000 that you earned over a course of a year. And you're competing for the same goods and services that are available. Now, because the Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars over the past several years, we're seeing the results of that now with inflation. So the goods and services that are available for purchase have not increased as rapidly as the supply of dollar currency. And that's the problem that we face. It's an unfair system. It has to change. And the only way to change it is to get rid of central banks and go back to sound money, gold and silver.
Right, I do agree. And so let's dive into some of the details of Money and Liberty, your most recent book. So on the cover, Statue of Liberty holding an ounce of gold and ultimately just symbolizing freedom.
Right there.
There you go. And so my copy's in the mail. But so to me, it kind of paints the picture, and I just pardon the doom and gloom viewpoint, but this decade, what we're experiencing now with this rebranding, restructuring, the agenda of a great reset, all these things have been thrown at us. In your opinion, is this the last stand for financial sovereignty for individuals?
I think it is.
Yeah.
And it's much broader than that. Back in the 1970s, I read a speech given in 1948 by Congressman Howard Buffett. Howard Buffett was a successful businessman in Omaha, and he served 4 terms in Congress. He was also the father of Warren Buffett, the legendary stock investor. Howard Buffett in this speech was making the point that in order to have liberty, you have to control your government. And the way you control the government is 2 things are necessary. One is you have to have the right to vote, free and fair voting. The second thing is you have to have control of the money supply. The control of the monetary system. And the only way you can do that is if you have gold and silver as your money, because gold and silver cannot be created out of thin air like central banks create dollar currency out of thin air. So what the government does, Mao Zedong said that political power comes from the barrel of a gun, but governments can't create bullets out of thin air. So what they do is they have this unholy relationship with the banking system to create dollar currency out of thin air, which the government then borrows and uses to buy bullets. It's an unfair system to us individuals. And it was, only the 20th century when that happened with we've lost a lot of basic freedoms as a consequence of this monetary system, which is inherently unfair. The last of it was 1971 when the final link to gold was broken. And now we're suffering the consequences, and sadly, just like the framers of the Constitution did during the War of Independence, the Continental collapse. I don't see why the dollar will not collapse either, but they're going to continue to use more regimentation to try to keep the system going.
Right. And a part of that, that regimentation, the advent of all these new different ways of furthering their power. But yet, before we can end the Fed, as a lot of people would like to do, we have to address, the current governmental structure. And so there's so much, in my opinion, corruption. You can't really trust the people that are supposed to be representing you. So because of this whole democracy concept, we're supposed to be a republic, but yet democracy is what they preach and all the events surrounding that. And so there's a midterm coming up this year, which I think will be crucial. But then again, they're trying to set the framework for who can vote, who can't vote, and things like that. My only question where I get lost is, how can we actually have systemic change when majority of the people have been dumbed down, distracted, and completely, they no longer value their freedom and liberty as a necessity to life. to nevertheless
Yeah.
get to the financial side of things. So that's the part where I've always struggled, because I attempt to reach people by letting them know what's going on. But, more people are waking up, but not fast enough, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, we have to take care of ourselves and our families. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure you're prepared for anything.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's worked for anything, coming down the pike, is owning some gold and silver, physical gold and silver. That's a core position in your portfolio. The other thing is then start educating other people about the way the system works and how unfair it is.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, governments will be forced to change their ways, either voluntarily or they will do it as a consequence of market forces. Because when you stop to look at it, the market is much bigger and much stronger than any government or even any group of governments. So, the market ultimately dictates, because people realize that, the point I make in the book about the pursuit of happiness, we make decisions constantly throughout the day to try to improve our situation. That's what I call the pursuit of happiness. If we're hungry, we eat. If we're tired, we sleep. We're improving our situation. And if people find that they can't improve their situation or satisfy their basic needs because of problems with the government, problems with the monetary system, eventually the governments are overthrown, gotten rid of, and they go to a new way. This has been the experience throughout the world. Even the Declaration of Independence basically says that. They overthrew the British Empire because their basic needs weren't being satisfied anymore, and the government had become too onerous. So what we need to do is we need to focus on what the system was, in terms of how money and currency should work in the American system. And it worked well until the 20th century, particularly after the First World War, when the gold standard was abandoned, and we never went back to gold in a meaningful way. We have to go back to gold in a meaningful way in order to reestablish this basic relationship that Howard Buffett was talking about in his speech, between people controlling the government rather than government controlling the people.
All right, very true. And so, and going back to gold, of course, silver is in that same picture. Now,
Yeah.
do you think, so in the decentralized space, there's this push for adoption narrative of, making Bitcoin spendable right now, and people look at that as gold 2.0 and say, why would you even spend that? Just let the Federal Reserve and all the currencies die. And on the other side of this, you'll have a hedge or insurance policy against fiat currency. So, do you think, in your opinion, that finding some way of getting back to using more likely silver in the short term and back in commerce and trade would be a way of probably promoting the use of real money again, rather than just continuing to promote it as an insurance hedge against fiat currency?
That is ultimately the answer, but there's a basic principle in monetary theory that's proven itself throughout the ages, is that when there are different types of currencies circulating, people hold and save the good currency and they spend the bad currency. So you're going to hold and save the gold and the silver until you actually need it. And the moment you need it is when you can no longer spend the bad currency because nobody accepts it anymore. So we either come to that voluntarily because the government accepts that the dollar is on the wrong path and headed in the wrong direction, or the market will force it. And when that will happen, we can't predict it because the future is unknowable. But we do know from reading monetary history and just common sense that we're heading in the wrong direction, that this system cannot continue anymore without continuing to erode liberty. I also make the point in the book about environmental degradation as a consequence of bad money and financial repression by central banks because they're making money look cheap. When you have interest rates artificially low, it tricks the human mind into thinking that we're wealthier than we really are. Right. But we're not. We're just overstepping nature's natural regenerative powers. And consequently, you're seeing environmental degradation as a consequence of bad money and central bank policy. Right. So on the one hand, they talk about climate change and all these other things. They claim the moral high ground, but what they're actually doing is heading in the wrong direction. And we have to recognize that and eventually be prepared for it when it does change, either voluntarily by the governments themselves or by the market forcing the change.
All right, very true. And then as we draw towards the end, I want to just, add in the fact that, as the inflation narrative continues to pick up, it's interesting how because of a lack of monetary understanding of how this all basically it's the reaching into the future for unrealized purchasing power, bringing it into today's
Right.
economy to try to prop things up. And so how people don't really realize how, asset price inflation, your house goes up in value, your portfolio looking stronger than ever, stock market's going through the roof. But then again, you can't have your cake and eat it too, because along with that, at some point, consumer prices increase, your food becomes more expensive, all the everyday necessities become more expensive. So people haven't been able to distinguish the difference. So that
That's
plays into
exactly
the financial repression side of things, I think.
That's exactly right. And that's why we should keep in mind this example of that I was talking about, filling up your family car with $2 silver, or the silver value of $2 silver. As inflation gets worse, the price of silver is going to go up. But basically, regardless what happens in the future, my expectation is that regardless where the price of silver is in Federal Reserve dollar terms, or where oil is or gasoline is in dollar terms, you'll still be able to use the silver content of $2 silver to fill up the family car. It's gold and silver have this consistency in purchasing power over long periods of time for a very important reason. They're only mined to the extent that they can be mined profitably. And the amount of gold, particularly that's accumulated throughout history, is a cube that could fit under the arches of the Eiffel Tower. That cube can grow about 1.75% per annum, and does year after year after year, which is the same as world population growth. So the supply and demand of gold are in balance, and that's why gold preserves purchasing power over long periods of time.
Right. Now, last question. So you've made it clear that you say you have 3,000 books or so that you've gone through. You're a student of history. And so in this book, Money and Liberty, what are some things perhaps you learned for the first time that helped you put this together?
I think the most important thing that's in the book is the difference between earned purchasing power and what I call phantom purchasing power. Phantom purchasing power that's created out of thin air. We have to remember what money and currency is, particularly what money is. Money just conveys purchasing power. And in order to have a fair and ethical and just society, you have to convey money in a fair and just and ethical way. And the way you do that, history has proven, is to have gold as the circulating medium. And that's what we have to go back to. And I think that's probably the key theme from the book. And all of these issues that we're dealing with today, ranging from environmental degradation on one hand to raging inflation on the other, these are all a consequence of avoiding natural money and abandoning natural money. We have to go back to gold, which is natural money. It's nature's money.
Nature's money. Well, James Turk, once again, it's great connecting with you on the release of your new book, as well as getting your insights on where we're at now. So as I mentioned before, you've been key in my educational journey. So from the money bubble to the collapse of the dollar to now Money and Liberty, I appreciate you for joining us here on RTD and dropping a lot of nuggets, because right now is the time, to me, this is the last stand for financial sovereignty and sovereignty in general. So I appreciate you for blessing us with your time. Amazon is where they can find the book. I'll put a link below for those that want to, get a hold of a copy. But once again, looking forward to connecting with you again. And it's been too long, but I appreciate you for making time for me today.
It's been great talking to you, Mike. And I hope your viewers find some benefit from this little interview. And thank you for the time.